Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has led her conservative Liberal Democratic Party to a landslide victory in a snap election she called just months after taking office. The LDP secured a two-thirds majority in the lower house for the first time, despite governing Japan for most of its post-war history. The vote was seen as a referendum on Takaichi's leadership and policies, including a tough stance on migration and a more assertive role for the Japanese military. Tokyo's stock market hit a new high on the news.
Hi, and welcome back to the channel. As you've just heard, the neo-fascist Prime Minister of Japan, Takaichi Sanae, the face that sank 1,000 ships, has led her party to its greatest electoral victory ever. Yes, ever. Her party, the Liberal Democratic Party, has been in power almost continuously since the end of World War II. And in all that time, they've never been able to win this big. In fact, no party in Japan ever has. The LDP won 316 out of the 465 seats in the lower house of the Japanese Diet. That's 6 more seats than what they needed for a supermajority. This means that the right-wing and now thoroughly fascist LDP has total control in the primary governing body of the Japanese government. This gives them full control over the budget, most laws, and nearly all political appointments. And yes, this includes the budget for the Japanese Self-Defense Force. The LDP now has the power to set that budget as high as it wants and to spend it on whatever it wants, since the senior leadership of the JSDF is directly or indirectly appointed by Takaichi herself. This opens a door to a massively expanded Japanese military. Keep in mind that Japan already has the second largest military in East Asia after China. Going forward, the JSDF will have the political and budgetary backing to invest in offensive weaponry, such as ballistic missiles, long-range cruise missiles, and bombers. The only things still off the table are nuclear weapons. Those are banned explicitly by Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, for now. And here's where we come to the one big thing that the LDP will not be able to do, and that's amending the Constitution, at least not until 2028. Constitutional amendments require supermajorities in both the lower and upper house of the Diet. The LDP is still in the minority in the upper house, and Takaichi does not have the power to call snap elections there. Instead, she has to wait until the normally scheduled upper house elections in 2028. So, if Takaichi can maintain her political grift for 2 more years, then she and her party will have the power to amend Japan's constitution at will. And when that happens, the LDP can water down or completely eliminate Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution that prohibits Japan from maintaining any offensive weaponry, declaring war, or possessing nuclear weapons. In other words, it will give Japan the legal cover it needs to commit fully to 1930s-style militarism and fascism. All this is to say that Takaichi's historic electoral victory signals the end of the post-war era in Japan. All the perfunctory guilt and pacifism born of 1945 is dead and buried in Japan, and the country is ready for another attempt at seizing hegemony in East Asia. This shouldn't come as any surprise. Historians have noted that national memories rarely endure past 3 generations. we are heavily influenced by our parents, somewhat influenced by our grandparents, and not at all influenced by our great-grandparents, whom most of us never meet. Japan is at that point where the generation that lived through the war as adults are no longer the parents or even grandparents of the typical Japanese voter. This is why Takaichi enjoyed the strongest support from the Japanese youth, not the elderly, who still harbor some notion of what Japanese militarism will ultimately lead to. This young cohort of Japanese, some 3 generations removed from 1945, seems entirely on board. We're turning the clock back 100 years to the 1930s. But, and this is a rather large but, even if Japan thinks it's the 1930s again, it's not the 1930s. The primary targets of their military aggression, that being China, North Korea, and Russia, are not only capable of defending themselves from Japanese aggression, but can, each on their own, turn Japan into the setting for the next Fallout game. Even without escalating to nuclear weapons, the conventional militaries of China and North Korea could easily defeat the Japanese Navy and Air Force, and no amount of Japanese investment in their military will bridge that gap. Japan is pumping itself up for a war that it cannot possibly win. As much of a mistake as it was for the Japanese to take on the Americans in World War II, them taking on the Chinese, North Koreans, and Russians in World War III will be a far greater mistake. Remember that the Americans blasted Japan twice as revenge for the 4,000 lives lost at Pearl Harbor. China's revenge will be paying for a far larger bill. So, in that sense, as a Chinese nationalist myself, I welcome the Japanese to rearm and ready themselves for war. If war is what they want, then we Chinese and our North Korean and Russian brothers in arms will be more than happy to play along. Bring it on. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, but what about the American Empire? Wouldn't they support Japan if things escalate to World War III? Well, yes, they would. In fact, the Americans would have to be the ones taking the lead. As delusional as Japan is, it's not so out of touch as to believe that it can solo the PLA by itself. It would need for the Americans to make the first move against China. Then they will jump in as the American sidekick, possibly even with the help of South Korea. But, and this is an even bigger but, not even the combined forces of Japan and the United States can stop the PLA at this point. The balance of power in that neighborhood has shifted so drastically in China's favor that no amount of coalition building can overcome China's industrial and military edge, at least not in China's own backyard. Now, if South Korea does get involved, then the 2 million men of the Korean People's Army, the Army of North Korea, would immediately join the fight. Supplied and reinforced by China and Russia, the KPA will make short work of the South Koreans, just like they did in the First Korean War. And the Korean Peninsula will be reunified under Pyongyang's leadership. If anything, Japan's push to rearm will only lend more false confidence to Washington. If we're lucky, the Americans will feel emboldened by Japan's militarism and commit itself to taking China head-on. And that would be awesome. Previously, American war games had mostly assumed minimal military aid from Japan in the event of a war over Taiwan. This is what led the Pentagon to conclude internally that such a war with China was unwinnable. But perhaps now, if they assume a far more robust Japanese commitment, then the Americans will be willing to take the risk and try to defend Taiwan by force. A Wu Mao can only hope. The last aspect of this historical landslide is what it signals to any future Japanese politician. Make no mistake, Japan's domestic situation is historically bad, and Takaichi has only made it worse by antagonizing her country's most important economic partner, which of course is China. And yet, the Japanese people came out to vote for her agenda in historic numbers. This puts to bed any notion that voters vote based on economic realities. No, they vote based on vibes. And in Japan, there's no vibe more popular than the China vibe. This teaches all future Japanese politicians that if they want to be elected, all they need to do is provoke China more. Part of this is honestly China's own fault. Despite Takaichi's provocations crossing multiple Chinese red lines, China hasn't done much at all in retaliation. All Beijing has done is to discourage, but not to ban, tourism to Japan, and to limit, but not to ban, rare earth exports. Beijing has the power to break the spine of the Japanese economy at little cost to itself. It simply chooses not to because Beijing still doesn't understand how to wield its economic power as a weapon. What this tells Japan is that they can use China as a political punching bag all they want, and China will do nothing about it. If I were a Japanese politician, I'd see this as an open invitation to go provoke China even more. After all, what would be the downside, so long as we don't actually go to war with China? Had China responded to Takaichi's provocations by crushing the Japanese economy underfoot, then the LDP would have been forced to apologize and bend the knee, making them look weak and stupid in front of the Japanese people. And they would have been wiped out in the snap elections rather than winning them in a supermajority. So, in that sense, the LDP has China to thank for its electoral victory. More precisely, China's usual brand of do-nothing geopolitical autism. But I think this autism and leniency does have its limits. If Japan were to actually start sending troops and setting up bases on Taiwan Island, that would force Xi Jinping's hand. At that point, even if Xi doesn't want to risk war himself, he would be forced to risk war, lest the Chinese people, or more precisely, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, overthrow him. We can only hope that Japan is stupid enough to take that step. Until then, peace.